So let me just say hi to everyone. Good afternoon and welcome to Refresh, or welcome back to Refresh. A time to connect, be inspired, learn something, and ultimately feel a bit better for this time we've spent together, because that's what Generation W is all about. And speaking about what Generation W is all about, I really would love everyone to register for Generation W. It is our 10th year celebration. I'm telling you, where does time go when you are having fun? 10 years. Our theme this year is intentional. Yes, we're really, really excited about it. And we are hoping that you will join us on April 16th. As for today, there's hope in the air. You guys feel it? Vaccines, while still challenging for many, yes, I know everybody's still trying to figure out how to get those much elusive appointments. There are so many more of us who are in line who have received them that it's really such a welcomed poke in the arm. It's that liberating feeling to know that you have an internal booster to ward off the virus. And for those who have doubts, I guess what I have heard that's most convincing, which risk would you like to take if it's a comparison of risks? And getting that virus, which by now we have so much data, proves so much safer than the alternative. So you have to do what you think is best, but certainly encouraging everyone to explore the virus and then make sure you get your appointments. It's great to know that the numbers are such that our government now believes every adult will have access to one by the end of April or May. And I have to say that light at the end of the tunnel that we often talk about, right, continues to get even brighter. I have to say, I do spend time thinking about what all of this means often. I'm sure you do too. What have we learned? What will we change? What will I change? What has already changed? So many good conversations, so much observation. And you know, for sure, we have to figure out every single day how we're going to be navigating the everyday of the next normal. Sometimes I wonder if we even notice what's changed. That's for another day. But I think that now there's a white hot spotlight on many things, and caregiving is certainly one of them. So many women pulled out of the workforce, not only for childcare, but senior care. The startling statistic of 800, I think it was 46,000 women alone in the fall, or it was 1 month, still rattles around in my brain. It's an astounding number. It's an astounding reality. I know this has rattled around the brain of Jane Newton Small's mind as well, because it's her personal experience with her dad's aging and his development of Alzheimer's that ultimately motivated her to look for much more closely at what she could do and ultimately help all of us figure out what we can do to help those we will be caring for. And I hope my mom's on. Mom, I love caring for you. I just wish you would get your computer right. When I first met Jay, she had authored one of my most favorite books. It's still one of my most favorite books. It was a bestseller called Broad Influence: How Women Are Changing the Way America Works. It became the impetus for us initiating here at Generation W local research on leadership and influence, which has ultimately now grown into a full-time position dedicated to women's leadership, housed here at our chamber. Jay, I have to say, that is Broad Influence, initiated by you. Jay previously was Washington correspondent for Time magazine, where she remains a contributor. At times, she covered politics as well as stories on 5 continents, from conflicts in the Middle East to the earthquake in Haiti, and in November 15th, Paris terror attacks. She's written nearly a dozen Time cover stories. By the way, she did all of this before she was what, 35, 30, something? Yeah, she's a child wonder. And she interviewed numerous heads of state, including Presidents Barack Obama and George Bush. And I think when I met her, you were on the Hillary campaign. She's now a proud founder, and we are so happy to support her in her work of MemoryWell, which is a national network of more than 425 journalists who tell the life stories of those living with either Alzheimer's or dementia in order to improve their care. Or actually, I know that's your focus, but also all of our elders, as we're looking to preserve their stories and actually create stronger connections. So thank you, Jay Newton Small, for joining us. It is always a joy to see you, because you have been such a revered and respected and welcomed member of the Generation W community from the day you showed up.
It's such an honor to be here, Donna, and it's like coming home. I love hanging out with you guys. It's always such a warm and, inclusive and intentional, to use your word, group of women. And I always learn something new from you every single time I talk to you. So I love being here.
Well, we love having you. So listen, tell us a little bit about you have such an interesting history, and you're writing it every day. By the way, you're writing your interesting history every day because you're a writer. But tell us a little bit about your background, your parents, their influence on you that brought you to today, if you would.
Sure. So, my father was diagnosed with Alzheimer's at a really early age. He was 58 years old, and I was still a senior in college when he was diagnosed. And so it was, I think a real moment for my family, to, that diagnosis. My mother ended up caring for him for the first 10 years of the diagnosis, and she, actually died of the stress of caregiving. So 40%, I learned these statistics later, 40% of dementia caregivers die before the one for whom they're caring because the stress is so great, particularly for dementia.
Yeah.
And that's a 2002 Stanford study. And she actually died of a stress-induced brain aneurysm in 2011, 10 years into caring for him at the age of 59. So the disease really, I think, took both of them in many ways. And so I became my father's primary caregiver at that point. And I was 10 years out of school. I was really, not anticipating that I would be a full-time caregiver ever. I mean, I thought maybe I would have kids and then I would care for them, but caring for my dad ended up being really like a whole sort of second full-time job for a long time after that. So I moved him up to Washington, D.C., where I was working for Time. And eventually I had to move him into a community. I don't know how my mom did it, honestly. They go through this shadowing phase. They call it the shadowing phase, where you're kind of like their island, and they know that something's wrong, but like you're their sort of like touchstone and anchor to like that they're okay, reality is okay. And he was going through that phase, and he would just shadow me all the time. And it was really, I think hard for me because he didn't sleep. Basically, he was a night wanderer. So I didn't sleep because he was constantly wandering around, and I was scared to death of him wandering away. And my parents also had a really great marriage, and that was wonderful. But I look a lot like my mother, and in many ways, my dad just thought I was my mom, and that got to be super awkward, where he would like want to make out, and I'm like, no. So like I'm going to need a lot of therapy here, and it just became really hard for me to care for him. And so I ended up moving him into a community. And when I did, they asked me to fill out this enormous 20-page questionnaire about his life. And I was sitting there struggling to write down the answers to these questions, thinking, I was a writer with Time magazine, and I challenge anybody to answer those questions well, like describe your parents' 40 plus year marriage in 4 lines, which is like writing haiku. And B, I didn't have like a lot of faith that anyone on that staff would read and remember 20 pages of handwritten data points for like the 100 residents there, especially when I learned again later statistics that most of these staff turn over at an average rate of more than 75% annually. So there's just a huge amount of churn in these communities. And
Wow.
so having written down a story, I handed in the form blank. I just was like, look, I'm a writer. I think it's easier for me and easier for you. And I just wrote down a story. And having written it down, I kind of plastered the community with it because I wanted them to know him. It was 1 page. I like put it up everywhere. And it really transformed his care. 2 of his caregivers were Ethiopian, and they'd had no idea that my dad had actually lived in Ethiopia for more than 4 years early on in his career with the United Nations. And they became his champions. They would sit for hours and ask him what it was like to work with Emperor Haile Selassie and what the Empress was like. And Dad loved it because he remembered Africa really well at that point from his early 20s, even if he didn't remember last week or last month or last year. And so MemoryWell, my company, grew out of that experience.
Wow, that's incredible. Tell us a little bit of you've had an interesting growing up experience because your parents were involved in international service. Tell us just a little bit about that.
Yeah, so my parents were sort of the classic UN marriage. My mother was Chinese Malay, my dad was Australian. They met in Zambia, married in Malawi, and I was born in New York. So that sort of is a very classic UN tale. And I grew up, I think, 10 countries over 5 continents as a child. So we moved a lot.
And how did that come, or have you totally reflected on how that's influenced your outlook on life, Jay?
Um, I guess so. I mean, I think I would say that my dad always used to have advice for me when I was a miserable kid crying that I'd just left all my friends and my dog and everything else in the last country. And he would say, the two things in life that you can always be sure of are time and change. And so if you're unhappy right now, you will be happy soon, like at some point. And if you're not, if you are like happy right now, you should really treasure that, because very soon you'll also surely be unhappy because things will change. And so it just made me really appreciate living in the moment, I think, and being intentional to really treasure those moments where things are going great and everything is sort of moving along and everything is working well together, but also not to fret too overly the moments where things aren't going great, where things aren't moving along, things aren't going together, knowing that soon it'll change.
Yeah, he'd probably be one of those great sages during this pandemic, right? If you're
I
happy,
think so.
happy, things will change. If you're unhappy, you'll get happy, things will change. I think that's really good advice. Usually I'd like to take this just a moment to welcome. We have people who watch us on Facebook, but we also have here. So Sue and Perrin, Melinda. I think Melinda actually probably has a story to share. I think she used MemoryWell for her parents. Maggie and Lisa Tepper, hello. Leah Latrice, so good to see you. Christine, hi, Kosh. Glory, Debbie, Charlene, Aileen, Angela, and then there's people with numbers I don't know, but hi, Barbara. It is so great to welcome all of you. And then eventually, Mariah will tell me who hi, Marianne Jacoby. I hope your event went great. And Siobhan Steele is here. Wow, Siobhan, I think Siobhan was with us when you first joined us, which was really great. And she also helped us with the broad influence when we did that initial research. So she's kind of a godmother of all of that as well. It's pretty cool. Okay, so you become a writer. You become a writer. And how do you do that while you're taking care of your dad? Because that seems to be one of the issues of the day, a huge issue, not only personally, not only for companies, but actually as a nation, because we don't do it very well, do we?
I think I was lucky that I was a writer in many ways, because unless I was going to press conferences on the Hill or at the White House or traveling for work, my schedule is very flexible, right? And so I could write at midnight and write. And honestly, magazine writers are like cats. We're like kind of never in the office. We're hard to wrangle. We are working in all kinds of weird corners and like investigating different things, and nobody really ever knows where we are. And so I think that it was easier for me. Potentially, I think for other people, I can't even imagine being like a shift worker, for example, and having to caregive for somebody with Alzheimer's. I think that would be incredibly difficult, if not impossible. Or trying to organize a very hyper structured schedule of school, perhaps like around this. I think it would be very difficult. But for me, for a while, I felt like Laura. Do you know that movie Love Actually?
Yes.
Okay. And do you know what breaks my heart is Laura Linney in that movie. Remember how she's like a caregiver for her brother who's in some sort of institution, and he calls her all the time, right? And in that movie, she is like the only person who doesn't find love, right? Like, and even in the sequel, they did like a little sequel for the Red Nose Society in the UK. She's also the only person who never finds love. And you're like, great. So that message means that caregivers are just destined to be the only people in the world that never find love. That's sort of terrible. But she's really attached to this phone where her brother's calling her all the time. And I think for a while with my father's care, it was like that. Like they would just call me all the time because I was the only person that he would listen to. Like I was the only person who could calm him down if he was in a rage, or who could really get him to stop doing what he was doing or change his behavior or whatever was happening. And so they would just call me all the time, and I would have to sort of drop everything and drive up to his community. Was happily, only a couple of miles away, and go and kind of calm him down and soothe him. When he kind of he went through a pretty bad behavioral phase, which happens with 25 to 50% of those people living with Alzheimer's and dementia. He got really violent. He punched a nurse, nearly broke her jaw, escaped the community. 5 hours later, fire and police like searching for him found him walking down Connecticut Avenue, which, if you know, DC is like a main thoroughfare. It's sort of really dangerous, and with, of course, no pants on, classic. And so it was, it was definitely really difficult. And I actually ended up working with a really renowned dementia specialist. He was such a problem child for this particular community. They brought in a woman named Teepa Snow, who is really, if you don't know Teepa Snow and you have a loved one with dementia, you should Google her because she's amazing. And
By the way, that's really, really helpful because I know a lot of people who are doing a lot of research on this now. TEPA, T-E-P-A?
I can put it in the chat, but it's TEEPA Snow.
Okay.
And so she has this whole system of gems that classifies different levels of dementia. And for example, the pearl stage is the last stage where you're really folded in on yourself, but there's still a little core pearl of that person in there if you can like get breakthrough and get them out. And she actually spent a week with my father working with him. They did a series of videos. I think she actually uses the videos on her website as examples of how to handle certain kinds of patients, sort of figuring out what was going on wrong with him, why he was getting these rages. Because really what happens is they're regressing back, at least my dad was, to different areas of their childhood. And he'd, regressed back basically to boys boarding school. And he was terrified of going into the bathroom because he thought people were going to haze him. And so he was afraid of male, orderlies or aides. He was afraid of going into the bathroom and being cornered. And he would fight like a caged animal to like not go anywhere near there. And she basically figured out this whole thing, that he was back in his childhood being hazed and that he was worried about getting beat up in the bathroom kind of thing. And we changed it so that instead of going into the bathroom, because he was incontinent and he was in a diaper, and that they would sort of move him into a big open light room. Only women would help him. They would sort of slowly change his clothes as he kind of walked around, because he was a walker. He was always walking. Then they would give him kind of a sponge bath quickly, change his diaper, and then get dressed again. And that solved it completely. No more rages, nothing. It was really amazing. And so, but I have to say, once he calmed down and he moved into another phase of the dementia, he lost his verbal skills, and he became just really a much different person. And I think it was in some ways easier for me because I wasn't getting calls every sort of 3 or 4 hours from the community, but in some ways harder because, he was really gone a lot more and harder to reach. And so he'd entered what they call the amber stage, which is the frozen sort of stage before the last stage, which is pearl. And so it's always a little bittersweet. And the caregiving, when it becomes easier, it also means that they're a little less there. So it's hard.
Wow, it really is hard. Hey, listen, I want to encourage anybody who has any comments or questions to please post them either on Facebook or on the chat. So let's talk about MemoryWell. I love the story where you posted all of his story, and the Ethiopian connection actually enhances his care. I had a little different experience, put her story together. And it was interesting to see her really try to reach back for things. And where it was hard for her, where it was easy for her, and also reveal more of her life that I was not connected to. And that created a greater connection for me and her, which I thought was really powerful. So tell us about MemoryWell.
So yeah, MemoryWell, like I said, and I'm so happy to hear that about your mom's story. MemoryWell grew, like I said, out of my experience caregiving for my father. And it really just started as a project where other families saw my dad's story around the community and they were like, hey, I want one of these for my mom or my dad. And so I'd written my dad's story in 2014, I think. And then my dad ended up passing in 2016. And as you know, in 2016, Broad Influence came out. It was a crazy year for me. I was covering the Hillary campaign. My dad died in July of that year. So it was just a really intense year for me. And then I was getting to the end of the Hillary campaign in October, and my boss was saying to me, what do you want to cover next year? And I was like, well, I'd love to cover like caregiving issues and aging. And he was like, that's not really a beat that we have. And he's like, how about covering the White House? And I was like, yeah, I'd already covered the Obama White House and the Bush White House, George W. Bush. And I just was so interested in caregiving issues. I was interested in MemoryWell, and MemoryWell was starting to take off. And we had our first, at the end of 2016, our first community come to us and say, hey, we'd like to pay for this service. We'd like to hire you and do these stories. And so I was like, you know what, like, I could either spend 2017 covering the Hillary White House because I thought Hillary was going to win at that point, or I could really start MemoryWell and see where this goes. And it really was almost like a calling. It just didn't even feel like a choice. It felt like I should do this because I can make a difference in people's lives by telling these stories. And every story we'd done thus far had really changed people's lives, and it just was so much more powerful. I mean, I think when I write for Time, I write for an audience of millions of people, but it's always about like the sort of 1%, the richest, most powerful people in the world. And when I write for MemoryWell, it's about the other 99%, and maybe 50 people, maybe 100 people might read these stories. But the impact on each person's life is so much more profound. And so it really, we could see this happening, and we were like, I'm just going to take a leap. And it really was a leap of faith. Sorry?
Is that you, that picture?
Yeah, that's me as a baby with my parents.
Oh, how sweet is that?
Yeah,
Building empathy, one story at a time.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
For our website, it was funny, like you can buy stock photos and things, but I have all my family photos, and I was like, rather than just buy stock photos, why not just use my family photos? So you'll see a lot of my family on the website. My mother and father's families are always a little bit like disturbed to see themselves on the website, but it's nice actually. It sort of really brings it back to its roots.
Yeah, it's so cool. I have to tell you, I read this story this morning, and Sherry will tell you that I read it and then couldn't find it, but then I found it because it just made me think about your work and all its intersectionality in terms of your reporting and the storytelling. So it's this woman, maybe you've all heard of her. I don't know. Her name is Sherry Turkle, and she's a professor at MIT who has real doubts about the value of technology. I don't want to overstate that, but she talks about storytelling and how we don't tell our stories. And she has a real interest in memoirs. And she says that generally people, whether it's scientists, engineers, designers, always present themselves in intellectual terms. Here's the work. But to support your work, she says that people are impassioned by their lives. They're impassioned by their childhood. They're impassioned by a stone they found on the beach that got them thinking. Everything about my research, when I started interviewing scientists, or in your case, people, show that their life's work was lit up by the objects, the people, the relationships that brought them to work. And I just thought that was so incredibly powerful because that is exactly what you're doing. It's a different relational perspective here. But what our research is saying, we are all tied in the experiences that we live through, and we bring them to wherever we are. I almost think it's kind of a shame that we have to wait till the end of our life. I think you're gonna have to make MemoryWell a little bit younger, that we're all sharing these stories, right? And I think you said that about, I was reading one of your articles and you said, I want people to learn from my lessons. And you wrote that when you were 32.
Yeah. No, I think that, my dad was diagnosed, like I said, when I was a senior in college, and so I was about 20 and 21. And I had the opportunity to tell a lot of his stories, right? Like, he became my first subject when I was a journalist, and I would interview him for hours about his life. And, I got to ask every question of him because he had the long goodbye. And I have wonderful tapes that I really treasure, that I listen to often, of him talking to me about his childhood and his life and things like that. But my mother passed so suddenly, and she was so young, and I never got the chance to ask her all those questions, and I never got the opportunity to. Now I have so many more, find out about her childhood and her, family history in so many ways. And so I've had to rely on her brother to ask a lot of those questions too. And there are things he just doesn't know. I mean, he was younger than her. She went to boarding school quite young as well. And then they sent her off from Malaysia to the UK. She went to Oxford. And so he didn't, see a lot of her life. And so there's just huge parts that are missing. And I think in some ways I want MemoryWell to honor my father and be able to bridge the gap between caregivers and medical staff and their patients when they can't really communicate. But then in other ways, I also just love the idea of telling people's stories at any age, because you never know what's going to happen. And if you can collect those and keep those, and there's so many more questions. Like people, every time we do a story, we give people a timeline that they can build on the story. So it's a digital timeline. You can add your own photos, music, movies, readings, anything you want. And the reason why we do that is because so many people came to us early on and said, but wait, like, when we send this to our extended family and friends, we see all the things you're missing. Like Uncle Joe wants to add the time when they went ice fishing in Michigan, or the grandkids look at it and they go, wait, you fought in World War II or in Korea, tell me more, I want to know more. And so the timeline is really for that ongoing conversation that you have. Like you said, with your mom, you learned so many more aspects of her life. It brought up so many more questions. And I just think it's such a great way to really come closer and see people in different lights, especially intergenerationally, and be able to ask all those questions and have them answered at any age.
Right. And it also brings up that whole intergenerational parental thing too, whereby as children, no matter how old we are, we don't really want to see our parents at some level as the kids they were. Although now I'm like, I envision my mom at 17, at 19, with, you know what I mean? It's an incredible, I don't know, experience to really think through that. I have a couple of questions that are starting to come through. Oh, this is a really nice comment. Latrice said, this is bittersweet. Thank you so very much for sharing your story, the work you're doing. I was a caregiver to my father who passed in 2018, and I'm still mourning. Subject matter is close to my heart, and thank you for these resources.
Oh, that's so wonderful. And I'm sorry for the loss of your father. I get it. And my dad passed in 2016, and even though I had 15 years to say goodbye to him.
Sharing that with you. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I might be on a bit of a lag. I hope I'm not, because I feel like I might be. I was just saying, it was I totally get the mourning thing. Even though my dad passed in 2016 and I had 15 years to say goodbye, I still miss him, feel his loss, and see things every day where I'm like, oh, he would have loved that, or wish I could tell him about.
Yeah, I think we never talk about this either. We don't sit down and really just like, hey, let's be in this moment together, right? Right? It just. Here's Jakimba Martin from the great Sigma leader in the great Sigma Gamma Rho sorority, also my sorority sister. What are recommendations for family members that are not the primary caregivers to support the primary caregivers as well as the family member?
That's a great question. So 2 things. One, there's a great book called The 36-Hour Day, which is, and I can put that in the chat as well. And it's sort of the Bible of family caregiving for those living with Alzheimer's and dementia. And there's a lot of great recommendations in that book, but it really sort of emphasizes all the different phases you could go through, how challenging this can be. And really, I think the primary caregiver here, as my mother was, is the one that's under the most amount of stress and the most amount of burden, since you have to really help them. And what I used to do is, because I was living in DC, my mother refused to go to help groups. She was like, no, I don't need help. And she hated the idea of opening up to strangers about the difficulties. And so I would go to help groups in Washington, and I would go to these sort of groups, group therapy kind of sessions or family counseling sessions. And I would say to them, this is what we're going through with my dad. So for example, Dad went through this weird paranoid phase, which is actually a common thing, where he was constantly accusing my mom of that she was stealing his wallet, that she was taking his money. And he was always like somebody's stealing things, and was just really paranoid all the time. And I was like, it's so hard. My mom's really struggling with this. And one of the women in the group was like, oh, my husband went through the same thing. All you have to do is create 12 different wallets, fill them with Blockbuster cards and old video, old business cards that no longer matter. And every time they're like, oh, you've stolen my wallet, just whip out another one and be like, here it is. And then they'll be like, okay. And it was amazing. It totally worked like magic. And she created these 12 wallets. And every time he was looking for it, she'd be like, it's right here. And he would calm down and it'd be totally fine. And so it helped her that I was going out to these groups, almost as in her stead. I was and getting this advice and finding ways to help her ease things. And so I would recommend that. And I think it was great for me too, because I could pour out my heart about how guilty I felt not being in Florida to help her, take caregive. I could also talk about what could I do, and they all had ideas of what I could do to help her. And so I think just, even though it feels weird, going in another city to a help group, I think it actually really does help.
Right. Well, so this is interesting because Mary Lee, hey, Mary Lee, She says, I'm curious if Jay had any feelings of resentment because she was balancing her dad and a big job.
No, my father made it very clear to me from a very young age, like from really the beginning of my career, that he made me promise all kinds of things. Like I would not be there at the end, that when he no longer remembered me, I wouldn't visit, that, and he basically said to me, if I ever in the afterlife find out that you compromised your life or your career to care for me, I will be furious at you. And um, Now, I broke a lot of those promises. I was there at the end. I did visit him even when he didn't know me anymore. But I didn't feel bad about taking assignments to go to Iraq, for example. And then I would FaceTime him from, on an iPad the community had from Iraq for like those few weeks or those months that I was in Afghanistan or in Iraq or like on assignment. I always tried really hard to FaceTime him. If I wasn't physically visiting, I would do it every couple of days or every few days, just so that he was there. I used to do a lot of television. I was on like CNN and MSNBC and stuff. And so I would get the people in the community to put me on TV. Like, so I would tell them when I'm going to appear, and then they would turn on the TV and he would see me. And then actually kind of was good in some ways because he felt like I was there, but it was bad in other ways because when I FaceTimed him, he would be like, well, what's the news? Because he thought I was like on television telling him the news. And so he would be like, okay, like, so tell me like, what's going on now in the world today? And so I almost would have to like do like fake broadcasts for him where I'd be like, well, today, President Bush did this, and so it was funny. Like, but he, I think every caregiver feels an enormous amount of guilt that you wish you could be there more. You wish you could be there all the time for them. But I had very clearly in my head his voice saying, if I find out you've compromised like yourself, then I will be pissed. And so I didn't have as much guilt when I was doing these assignments, and going off and living my life.
Well, I do know that Charlene, as she says here, is taking care of two elderly parents, and she just recently retired. And the challenge is, how do you make sure that you can carve out time for yourself? I mean, this really does play along those lines of guilt. And I feel them too with my parents, right? They're older, they need things. They're like, we don't want to bother you, we don't want to bother you, but you want to be there because you're very conscious of time, right?
Yeah. I think it's hard. That's often the thing that suffers the most for caregivers, right? Like, especially for women where you're like, I need to be there for my career. I, need to be there for my kids. I want to be there for my parents. And then there's like zero time for you. And something like there's an amazing statistic from EMD Serono. They have all these, they have this group, I think it's called not, it's a caregiving group and I can't remember the name of it, but it's like carers in the US or carers. And something like 70% of primary caregivers don't have time to go to doctor's appointments of their own because they're just too busy caregiving. And that's like really dangerous. And like my mother, for example, she knew that something was going wrong. Her mother died of a brain aneurysm, in her 50s, and she knew something was happening, but she just never went to get it checked out. She never went to the hospital, and she never told me about it. And I visited for Christmas, and everything looked fine, and she seemed okay. They were in the process of moving to DC because she knew that that she needed more help, and I was like going to help out more when they moved to DC. And literally, like when my mother died in March of 2011. I flew down, and it was clear that for at least several weeks something had been going wrong because she'd started hoarding like Costco supplies, and like the house was like full of like trays of canned soup and like ramen boxes, massive boxes of ramen. And I was like, what is going on? Like, and something was neurologically going wrong, and I had no idea. And my dad obviously wasn't in a position to tell me about it. And then she'd had the aneurysm, and and that was it. And so it really broke my heart that I had not known this, that I hadn't seen it, that I hadn't been there more for her. And I think you just have to really watch them like a hawk because they're more capable of hiding it, and they're more prone to hiding it because they're like, their default is I can handle this myself.
We can all, we all can, but we can't. There's two things here I want to come back to. Actually, there's three, but I just want to welcome everybody to Refresh. We're here with Jamie Small today. We're talking about caregiving. We're talking about the power of storytelling. We're talking about the remarkable accomplishments of a young woman who's been through many careers so far and started a business. And I'd like to go there for a minute, Jay, because you have pivoted from Capitol Hill to the battlefields of, or I'm not saying you were on the battlefield, maybe you will.
I was.
Okay, in Iraq and Afghanistan, and now creating a company that's helping people's later life care. We asked you for some tips on that. So would love for the Jay's tips. Sherry's going to put them up for you. Jay's life journey. Here we go. You talk about meaning. Mm-hmm. Talk to us about this.
You know, I think this is a bit like about your intentionality. You know what I mean? Like being intentional about approaching things, about trying to you know, like find, I guess, you know, I feel like there's no randoms in life, and that you just are on a path, and so I try to find meaning in almost everything, and like, and not that I'm like wandering around being like, what are the signs of the universe, but more like you know, just like I want my interactions to be meaningful. I wanted my conversations with my dad to be meaningful, and it wasn't that great if I just sat with him and watched television. You know, if I was going to take the time to like go and be with him, I wanted to really be with him. And so that meant like walking with him or talking with him or trying to play Scrabble with him if he was able, or we built these like bird feeders together. And then he loved feeding the birds. And so we would feed the birds together, but just trying to find ways in which those interactions were meaningful, and that I was getting time with him and he was getting time with me. And it wasn't just me sitting like watching a television with him, in which, you know, I could have been there, I could have not been there. So for me, like that, and as I think my time has shrunk in my life and I don't have a lot of spare time, you know, someone asked earlier, like, how do I find time for self-caregiving? I would say, I try at least once a month to like go do something for myself, right? Like get a massage, get a pedicure, like, you know, even if it's like get a facial, go get a haircut, which I really need right now. It's getting very long. But like, you know, just do something for myself every single month. And that's something that is meaningful to me, that is like, you know, that makes me happy. But even like time with friends, and I think that's been an odd gift of COVID, is that instead of like seeing friends in passing in group situations and like cocktail parties or whatever it is, the DC social scene, and you always feel like you never get to catch up with people, it's been like a real year and a half of like very intentional, like, okay, one-on-one, we're gonna like Zoom, or we're gonna, you know, meet for a walk or really catch up with that person. And I feel like it's been so much more profound in many ways. I've gotten to know people who I thought were my closest friends so much better during the crisis in many ways, just because we've had so much more one-on-one time. And so I think that's what I mean when I say everything should be meaningful, is that like I'm really careful with how I spend my time, because, you know, I don't have a lot of free time, and I want it to be, when I do spend it, like in really something that fulfills me.
That's awesome. How about, okay, people are just loving that. Lots of positivity here. How about embracing the leap?
So this, I think, is a bit for MemoryWell, but it's a bit for everything in life. And, you know, I think that like going to cover war, I was really afraid that I would be afraid and I would run away and not be able to go to the front lines. And that was a huge test for me. And the fact that I came away from it like, okay, I did it and I didn't run away. And, you know, and I was courageous enough to like sort of stick it out and tell the story. Was a big sort of like life, like, okay, checklist, like I did it, like it was an accomplishment. With MemoryWell, like starting the company, that was terrifying. Look, I was leaving one of the best jobs in journalism. I had a really great career. I was, you know, at the peak of my career. I could have been covering, well, at that point it was the Hillary White House, but the Trump White House, which maybe doesn't sound so great, but like covering the White House in general. I could have been doing a lot of other things than starting MemoryWell. And, but for me, it was taking that leap, that faith that like, I can make a difference here it's worth the risk. It's worth my personal risk to take this leap, and in writing Broad Influence, for example, there's an old trope where they say women, have to be asked 7 times to run for office. And with a man, you get halfway through the question, and he's like, yes, I'll do it, it's been sort of battled down. Maybe it's not 7 times, maybe it's 4 times. I mean, nobody knows the exact number. Obviously, this is a guesstimation, but I think it's clear that you must ask a woman multiple times to run for office, that she's much less willing to take a leap than the average man, right? Because women inherently, as I write in my book, are more risk adverse. And that's something that is, not all women are like this, obviously, but generally speaking, studies show that women are more cautious. And so I think it's, to be able to take that leap, you have to have confidence in yourself. You have to be able to have the faith that even if you totally fail, you're going to learn some new skills that are marketable. You're going to be able to take that and go and succeed in other ways, even if you fail at this thing. But that the leap is worth it, because if you don't take that risk, you're never going to learn those new skills. You're never going to impact other people's lives. And I think for me, that it was scary to take that leap, but it was so worthwhile. And even now, if MemoryWell fails, which gets to the next point, I still will have learned an enormous amount of new skills. I still will feel like I have taken a path that I will never regret, because it'll lead to so many other things. Even if MemoryWell itself doesn't succeed, I can go do any number of other things. My world is much larger and bigger than it was even as a journalist. And so that gets to the last one, which is failure is a great teacher. I don't want MemoryWell to fail. I don't think we are going to fail. I'm really excited for it to succeed. We actually just yesterday did a press release where we announced we closed $2.5 million of seed funding from venture capital, which is our first venture raise, which makes me one of the 2.2% of women who've actually raised venture. I think less than 1% of women of color. So, but I think in my life as a journalist, I learned more from the corrections that I had to do than I did from the huge success stories. I learned more from the pain, of caregiving for my dad, and the hardship of, feeling like I was constantly failing from it and always working harder to address that, than I did when times were easy. And so I think that, failure is the greatest teacher. It's such a trope, but it's so true. And I think you have to learn to not feel the oppressiveness and the sadness and the horribleness of the failure, but embrace it and say, okay, what can I learn from this? How can I make lemonade out of lemons? And really, that is MemoryWell, right? It's making lemonade out of the lemons of, the hardship of caregiving for my father.
Okay, without a doubt, without a doubt, it's such an important conversation. There's so much MemoryWell goodness for all of us. I mean, if anyone's like me, I'm thinking, okay, I got to do the next MemoryWell. I've got to get the next story going. Maybe you should give us, if we're sitting with somebody want to build a story, what are the questions we should be asking?
Sitting with them and asking their life story. I always like to start at the beginning. So tell me about your childhood, and even something as easy as tell me your name. Who are you named for? I had a woman the other day, I was like, what's your date of birth? And she was like, well, we don't really know when I was born, because my pappy was murdered. He was pushed off a coal tipple, just before my mother went into labor, and we were on the run from Eastern Kentucky to Western Kentucky. It was this amazing story. Right. And so she's like, I was born either on the 4th or the 5th of August, but we were never quite sure. I mean, so you just never know what simple question, like your date of birth and your name, could bring up all kinds of interesting. I was named for my great aunt who survived the Great Depression by walking from Oklahoma to California. I mean, you just don't know. And so the simplest things, I think, and the most open-ended questions are often the easiest. And so just asking people, what were your childhoods like? What did you love to do? What did you what did you study? What sports, what extracurriculars, what pets, what siblings did you have? Is church important to you? Did you dance? Did you love music? Did you sing? Maybe in the choir? All of these things, I think, and then once you have the foundation of childhood, it becomes easy to then inform the rest of your life. Oh, did that inspire you? Did your love of music inspire you to become a conductor or become a church choir, leader, or whatever it is? Did your love of math make you into an engineer? Like, and so just being able to trace those passions starting in early childhood through someone's life, I think you often see the seeds of it, and then you can grow from there.
So let me ask you, like, you are a reporter, always will be. I'm sure it's part of your DNA. You're a storyteller, but you're also, you're at Capitol Hill. You looked at policy, right? You can take a step back. So now, how many stories has your company done? 20 to 30,000?
No, gosh, no. We've done hundreds, and we're at 4,000, like, I would say users right now.
Okay, 4,000 users. Okay. Any trends that you're seeing that you want to share? What pops out and says, you know what, what are you seeing about the need for caregiving? Is there something we need to be done on a national level, or what kind of trends are you tease out of what you're seeing in these stories?
The stories themselves, I think, we've seen, I think we just see that, like, people have so many more questions after the stories. And I think that but we see, I think the more interesting thing for me is, one of the things we want to do in the near future is just to start to capture the caregiver stories on the other side of things, because so often when we're telling the story of somebody, especially somebody who can't tell their own story, there's a caregiver with them who's helping them tell that story. And then the caregiver often has an amazing story themselves. And I feel like every time I tell my story, and I'm really public about it, and, in ways in which my parents probably, if they were alive, would not necessarily love, but I also feel that, too often people are embarrassed about caregiving, and they think of it as the secret, or, oh, I wouldn't want to embarrass my loved one because I shouldn't say that they did this or they did that, or, or they had this disease or that disease. It's private, it's family. They don't even consider themselves a caregiver. They don't even define themselves as a caregiver. I certainly didn't when I first became my dad's caregiver. It took me a while to realize that that's what I was. And so, and it isn't until I think we realize as a society, like, the burdens of caregiving, that how much of our treasure and our blood and our sweat and our equity and our brain power and our workforce is going into this caregiving, that we're going to realize that there needs to be more support here. And when you see the huge amount, the staggering amount of expense and of just work that goes into it, I think that has to be informed by people willing to tell their stories. And so I always encourage people, tell your stories as caregivers. I tell my story as a caregiver, but don't be afraid to come forth and say your story out loud. Talk about how hard it is, because it isn't until that we as a society can talk about how difficult this is. And trust me, millennials, 25% of caregivers are millennials, and millennials are talking about it ad nauseum. They're like the only people out there talking about it, right? But, like, there's this older generation sort of real sort of hesitation to talk about these things. And I think you need to talk about it, because then when you talk about it, people will begin to help, and they'll begin to see the needs and can help fill them. And so that's something that I think is going to be really important moving forward.
That's fantastic. And Aileen, she wants to share your work, and we're all going to encourage you to do that. Here's a couple of things, Jay. I really want to find out about your experience in Iraq and Afghanistan. So maybe that's another time we get together. But right now, I just wanted to say, here's some of the things that and I hope everyone has highlights for themselves. But one, we hear it all the time. I was thinking about this about myself the other day, like, just what a great teacher failure can be. And that you have learned more from your corrections and from the pain than you did from when all times were good. So let's not run away from risk and failure. They can be great teachers in our lives and actually push us forward in places that we want to go and might be a little too afraid to get to, right? Then you're encouraging us to talk about our stories, because that's really important. And here's the other one. I want to remind all of us, especially all of us women. Remember, J. Newton Small said, we need to do something for ourselves every single month. I'd like to think every single week, but, like, let's start somewhere, because we're always deferring self-care, right, Jay?
Absolutely.
We always, that's right. So I want to thank you for all that. And I want to share with everyone, because it's just about time for us to get going. This time always goes so fast. But next week is another topic I believe that the pandemic has shed a white hot light on. It's actually a continuation of this one, because also It's also an intentional focus of Generation W. I might even say a founding focus of Generation W, which is the power of connection. And I think that's where Jay's story is also about, really the power of connection in different stages of our lives. But next week, no, it's not next week, actually. It's St. Patrick's Day, the 17th of March. We'll welcome Susan McPherson. Susan has a new book coming out called The Lost Art of Connecting. It's filled with humor, humility, and wisdom. And it's a handbook about how to foster personal and professional relationships that blur the lines between work and play. And I think that's something we are all experiencing as an accelerated pace as a result of COVID. And I think what they're saying about this book, it will enrich our lives in every way. Of course, all of these books will, right, Jay? All of our books do that. And then of course, the next big celebratory connection, I'm reminding you again, is Generation W, April 16th. And we wanted to share with you just a little bit of a tease. Remember to register. Sherry, take it away. Register now, genwnow.com. Thank you, Jay Newton Small. We love you. This is, we will see you again soon. We'll figure it out. Everybody, her company is MemoryWell. I think we all understand the power of storytelling. All of us who have parents who are aging, all of us who are getting older as well. There's an application for all of it. Susan McPherson on March 17th. And thank you to our producer, Sherry, Mariah, for helping out. Thanks, Mariah. Appreciate you and our whole Generation W team. Remember, register August 6th, I've done that every time. No. April 16th. See everybody.
Thank you so much, Donna, for having me.